Station. We have an unidentified object for review. Over.
Go ahead, Space Station.
It seems to be.
Go ahead.
It's,
Go ahead, Space Station.
Okay, I've made my decision. It's a cricket ball.
What?
6. What a shot. You bigot. Out of the park and into the sky.
The ICC Men's T20 World Cup.
It's out of this world.
Buy your tickets now from tickets.t20worldcup.com.
Turn up your radio to the clean fresh sound of WEFM 99.9.
Yeah. Been waiting, anticipating, can't wait to start celebrating. Good vibes, good people, right now preach good over evil. Home nothing, sleep nothing, right now just hold on something. Party night when we create a vibe, cause I'm outside with me friend. We not toting stress and problem, cause we outside and we pumping. We don't care who watching. Don't take it no way. If my crew in the fat, yes, they're soaking wet and they better than yours. Don't take it no way. If your man in the dance and him want take a chance on the next girl, don't take it no way. Just hold for the friend and sway.
WEFM, the clean fresh sound.
Welcome back, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It is now 8:05, and we'd just like to remind, at least the St. Vincent Electricity Services would like to remind customers to pay in full any balance brought forward from previous bills to avoid the inconvenience of being disconnected. This is an urgent message to customers in the areas between Richland Park and Bayaboo, Kingston and Annisvale, and Montrose and Camden Park. Customers are being reminded of Vinlec's ongoing weekly disconnections in Kingston and surrounding areas, Beckway, Canawan, Union Island, and Myro. Please take note that disconnected services cannot be guaranteed reconnection within 48 hours. Payments for reconnection should be made at the corporate headquarters at Paul's Avenue between 8 a.m. and 3 p.m. weekdays. Customers in the customers in the Grenadines can make payments at the Bank of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and the St. SVG Post. Right now, we have our cop chat. We have our cop chat this morning, and we'll dive right into that.
WEFM, the clean fresh sound.
Cop Chat. You've got questions for the police? They're here to give you the answers on WEFM 99.9.
Such a cruel place. Something is wrong with the human race. Preacher man say it's wonders and signs. We are living in the end of times. Where is the love we once used to know? Where is the kindness we used to show? The heart of man is so full of hate. Let's make a change before it's too late. Too much killing, too much blood spilling. Each and every morning. It's weeping and mourning. We've got to stop all the crimes, erase the violence, let our voice be heard. We can't sit in silence. The hope of tomorrow is in our use today. We've got to live in love. Crime and violence don't pay.
Once again, welcome back, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The time is now 8:08 in St. Vincent and the Eastern Caribbean, and It is now time for Cop Chat. You're listening to Ari, and joining me is Roleza, and we have with us Attorney General in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Honorable Grenville Williams. This morning we'll be discussing what the new amendments to the Criminal Code and Firearm Act mean for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Good morning, Mr. Williams.
Good morning. How are you? Good morning, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Good morning to listeners further afield. And I'm happy to be here this morning to discuss this issue with you.
All right. So where do we begin this morning? The new changes relate to the firearms, the traffic, I believe it is.
Okay, there are two essential issues that we will discuss today. First are the amendments to the Firearms Act, Chapter 386 of the Laws of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, as well as an amendment to the Criminal Code. The amendment to the Firearms Act speaks for itself by the name of the legislation. The Criminal Code in St. Vincent and the Grenadines is the principal piece of legislation that deals with criminal offenses. There are other statutes that deal with criminal offenses, but the Criminal Code gives you a wide spectrum. So it deals with crimes against property, it deals with crimes against a person, it deals with sexual offenses. In Part 8 of the Criminal Code, that is where sexual offenses are addressed. And those are the issues we will discuss as it relates to the amendment under the Criminal Code. So on one hand, firearms offenses, and on the other hand, sexual offenses.
All right, so I know recently we saw the information with regards to sexual offenses and I think firearms. Just for clarity's sake, were there amendments made to property as well as person, or?
No, that's why I wanted to say specifically the amendments related to Part 8 of the Criminal Code. But the Criminal Code itself discusses a number of criminal offenses, not just sexual offenses, but it's looked at in sections, and Section 8 focuses on the issue of the sexual matters.
Okay. All right. So if you can let us know what were the most significant changes that were made with regards to the Criminal Code and reasons behind some of these amendments.
Thank you very much. In order to look at that, I think we have to set a context. Generally, the criminal law is there because someone is going to contravene the laws of the country. These laws that have been established through policy decisions, which are then put into writing by the chambers of the Attorney General, and the Parliament then debates these bills, which then become an act. In many instances, if we have a law that has no enforcement, it would really be like just giving very good advice. So in order to make the law effective, we need punishment that accompany the provisions that tell you, do not do these things, do not do certain things, otherwise you would offend society in general, the morals of society, what society see as the general good. So that's the beginning. Then we have to look at what are the objectives of punishment. So if you break the law, most people in society would want to see some sort of sanction against you as the individual. But what's the reason for these sanctions? First is to deter persons. So if we have sentences that people see as severe, they are likely to think twice before they commit an offense because there is going to be a severe penalty. And the penalty can be a fine, the penalty can be imprisonment, or the penalty can be a combination of those things. The other thing is that we want to take a person out of society if their crime is very serious, if their crime is heinous. So we want to incapacitate them, prevent them from being able to continue their life of crime or to perpetuate another crime. That's one of the issues. An important element, however, is rehabilitation. We want to see a change in behavior. Because yes, you may have had an injudicious moment, but coming out of that, you're unlikely to reoffend if we are to change your behavior by educating you, by informing you as to what you should really be doing, what type of behavior society expects of you. There's an element of retribution, because certainly if somebody does something to you, you want to see them punished. It's the biblical way.
Justice.
An eye for an eye. That's the traditional way. You hurt me, I want to see you hurt as well. But I don't want to do the hurting in retaliation. I want the system to do it. And depends on the nature of the crime, we want to see some form of restitution. In other words, if you steal a man's chicken, we want to put the man back in a position where he has his chicken. So you pay him something. How does this fit into our discussion today? We've seen some amendments, first to the firearms legislation. And what we've seen primarily is an increase in the penalties as it relates to firearms offenses. And we start with the issue of a firearms license. A firearm is really just a tool. It is how you use the firearm and the context of the firearm that in many instances become quite relevant. There are many persons in the Vincentian society who hold firearms, who own firearms. But in order to do so within the law, you must obtain a license from the relevant authorities. There's an amendment to that where you do not hold that firearm with a license. So you may have had a license, but for some reason you didn't pay attention and you didn't renew your license on time. There's an amendment there. Those are not really the people we want to target. So there's a slight increase in the penalty as it relates to not holding a relevant license at the time. But that's really to encourage you to get your license. What we need to turn to is possession of a firearm where you hold that firearm without a license. So you smuggle a firearm into St. Vincent, you go on the street and you purchase a firearm. And I would say in many instances without any good intention.
So illegal possession.
Illegal possession. And that's what we really want to target.
If you don't mind, tell the listeners the three elements of possession.
Well, we'll get into that shortly, but I want to go along the offenses first.
Okay.
Because I don't want to get sidetracked in too much detail at this point.
All right.
So possession of the firearm is what we want to target at this point. Under the old regime, the penalty was imprisonment not exceeding 10 years on conviction at the magistrate court. We call that the summary conviction. But really is when you go before the magistrate court. If you go before the high court, which is an indictment, so people use the word indictment, but really you're going before the high court in this matter. And it was 20 years. So now, if you go before the magistrate court on a summary conviction, you are going to look at a maximum of 15 years. So you move from 10 to 15. And now if you go before the high court, which is an indictment for possession, we increase it by 5 years. So instead of doing 20, you're looking at a maximum of 25. Then there is an amendment to Section 18, which is possession with intent to injure. And there's a few sections, which is why I don't want to go into the details just yet. And under the old regime, again, summary conviction in the magistrate court was $10,000. That's the fine. Now you pay $15,000. And these are the maximum, of course. It doesn't mean that when you are charged and sentenced, this is what you will pay. And on indictment, it was $30,000 and a term not exceeding 20 years. So here you have the fine and you have the term of imprisonment. Now you're going to look at $35,000 and over 22 years. So there's a slight movement there in terms of the number of years. Section 19, possession of a firearm that's imitation with an intent to commit. Again, I don't want to go into the details, but what imitation means is we're not looking at a water gun. Because if you hold up a water gun, a man going to know that's a toy. But you know, you have something that looks like a 9mm You can't tell that it's made from plastic and it's not real, so you're in fair that it's a firearm. So we had a term not exceeding 5 years. Now we've moved that to 7 years in the magistrate court at the summary level. And we had 25 years before. Now it's 30 years. We have a new section being inserted, and this section speaks to what is called a ghost gun. Again, I don't want to go into all the details, but in simple terms, a ghost gun is a firearm that does not have a serial number on it. Because all firearms have a serial number that we could identify if it was issued to Roleza, if it was issued to Ari. So that's what a ghost gun is in summary. So there's a new offense there. And there's a restriction on the sale of firearms. You can sell firearms because you could be a firearms dealer. That's how people lawfully get firearms. But again, you need a license to do so. If you sell firearms without a license, it was $7,000 or 3 years. Now it's $10,000 or 5 years. Prohibited weapons, and I'm going to move a little bit faster now because we have quite a few issues. 5 years, 20 years. We move to 7 and 25 years. Converting a firearm, 5 years, 15 years, 7 years, and 17 years. So those are some of the key ones under the firearms legislation. I'll move quickly to the sexual offenses. So we could set the context and then we could go back to the general discussion. So there are two offenses for which we did not need to make any changes. One is rape. Because under the current legislation, the penalty for rape is life imprisonment. You technically can't go any higher than life imprisonment. We have removed the death penalty indirectly by case law.
But our life still stands at what, 30 years, relatively speaking, 27?
Right. I want you to hold that question until I go through the offenses. But that's a very important discussion because we want to also, in that discussion, look at what constitutes a prison year, and we want to look at what constitutes life. But we come back to that.
I'm going to write it down.
Right. So for rape, it's life imprisonment. And for sex with a minor under the age of 13, it's also life imprisonment. So we didn't need to make any change there. Where we started was intercourse with a girl under the age of 15 years. So we made some changes there. And we made a significant change because under the old regime, the maximum was 5 years. We've increased this by 10 years. So it's now 15 years starting the maximum. We have indecent assault, and again, we doubled it in this case. So from 5 years to 10 years. Indecency with a child, we moved from 1 year to a maximum of 10 years. So that's a significant change. Permitting a girl under 15 to use the premises for intercourse, we moved that from 14 years in some instances to 15 and 7 years to 10 years, depending on the court. Causing or encouraging prostitution of a girl, 7 years to 15 years. Encouraging prostitution of a woman, 14 years to 15 years. Detention in a brothel, 14 years to 15 years. Man living on earnings of prostitution, 14 years to 15. Woman exercising control over prostitution, 14 to 15. And we have a number of others. Procurement of woman under false pretense, 2 years to 7 years. Administering drugs to facilitate intercourse, 5 years to 10 years. And incest by a man, 14 years to 20 years. So in a nutshell, those are the substantive changes in relation to the firearms as well as the sexual offenses.
And under those lists for prostitution by itself, is that down? Because you spoke of procurement.
Yes.
You spoke about being in a brothel. Well, is prostitution itself down?
Well, the thing about it is that we have a lot of offenses around prostitution. And I would also say to you this, that this offense is not necessarily one that is easy to prove. So we have all of these offenses on the book. But how many charges have actually been brought under some of these offenses. If there's a rape, we have strong evidence because you may have the victim reporting, you may have persons who witness it in some form or fashion, whether directly or indirectly, are reporting. If somebody is engaging in prostitution and it is done voluntarily,
self-employment.
Well, that's your definition of it. But the point is, gathering the evidence may be a bit more complex in those circumstances. But we have a number of offenses surrounding the issue of prostitution that can facilitate an investigation, can facilitate a prosecution, and where the prosecution is successful, then we can look at the issue of a penalty that is appropriate in the circumstances.
Would you consider these laws gender biased?
Well, I think you're first referring to the sexual offenses.
Mm-hmm.
And I am certain in my presentation, in most cases, it said of a girl under age of 13, a girl under the age of 15, a woman in many instances. And I think traditionally, when someone thought of rape, they would think in the context of a male-female engagement and penetration from a male to a female. I think what we have to do is put it in a bit of context where a sexual engagement between persons who are not of the opposite sex was and probably, I would say, still is unlawful. So I think that sort of shaped the legislation, because if there is penetration of a male, it means it technically would have been done by a male, which would fall more under the buggery sort of provisions. So yes, because of the history and the context in which these laws were developed, there would appear to be a bias to looking at the female gender as the vulnerable ones, the ones who need protection, and therefore the ones that the law would show as being the general victim, where the male would be seen as the perpetrator. But of course, time is evolving. And what I like to say to people, the law is a living thing.
Mm-hmm.
So as society evolves, the law should evolve to reflect, to an extent, where society is. So I believe in the future, you would see more gender-neutral language as society evolves, as there's more advocacy for some of these issues.
All right, so the time is 8:26. We're going to take a quick commercial break, and we'll be back with more Cop Chat soon.
Do you want to feel clean or refreshed after using the bathroom, whether at home, work, or play? Welcome to My Smart Toilet Seat. All of our products wash your private parts after using the bathroom without the use of your hands. Let's hear what our national table tennis champion, Damian Dublin, has to say.
I tried it and it works. There are 4 options. Simply add an attachment to your existing toilet seat, or choose a non-electric seat, or better, an electric seat that washes and dries you with warm water and air. Lastly, get a complete smart toilet that also flushes itself. What are you waiting for? Get your smart toilet seat today. Be smart, be refreshed, be clean, be a winner like me.
Our smart toilet seat is available throughout St. Vincent at retail outlets with the orange flags. You can call us at 457-1703 or visit our website at justwashit.vc.
Yes, sir.
Our industry relies on all of us to play our part. We take pride in showcasing our beautiful island, our craft, our cuisine, and our warm Vincentian hospitality.
Each of us play a crucial role in showcasing our vibrant tourism industry.
We can create spaces where visitors can unwind, connect with nature, and embrace tranquility of our beautiful surroundings.
We need everyone on board to help us create an exceptional experience for our guests.
Join us at our National Tourism Community Consultations as we shape the future of tourism in St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
It's everyone's business, yeah. Live it, love it, embrace it.
That's the sound of your animals. Strong, healthy, and delivering yields you love. That didn't just happen. It began with you feeding them only the best. East Caribbean Feeds. Rest assured, we only produce your feeds with premium ingredients. No hormones, no animal byproducts. Just everything your animal needs for maximum nutrition. Because your animals deserve only the best. East Caribbean Feeds from Maximum Nutrition.
Evangelist Bridget Blucher, in association with BBS Ministries, presents a Mother's Day boat ride entitled Step Aside, I'm Still Here. It's an all-white affair coming your way on Saturday, May 11th with live ministry by Minister Bridget Blucher, Pearl McMaster, Andres Bascom, and Ronnie Richards. The Admiral 2 departs from SVG at 8:30 a.m., then returns from Beckway at 4:30 p.m. It's the Mother's Day all-white boat ride on May 11th. Tickets only $60 to include boat ride and concert in Beckway. Tickets available at Splitting Images, Beauty Salon, 784-532-0654, Spotlight Restaurant, Paul's Avenue in Kingstown, 784-453-1253, and the Music Center, 784-456-1746. It's the all-white boat ride affair on May 11th. You can't afford to miss it.
WEFM, the clean, fresh sound.
Cop Chat. You've got questions for the police? They're here to give you the answers on WEFM 99.9.
The world has become such a cruel place. Something is wrong with the human race. Preacher man say it's wonders and signs. We are living in the end of times. Where is the love we once used to know? Where is the kindness we used to show? The heart of man is so full of hate. Let's make a change before it's too late. Too much killing, too much blood spilling. Each and every morning, it's weeping and mourning. We've got to stop all the crimes, erase the violence, let our voice be heard. We can't sit in silence. The hope of tomorrow is in our use today. We've got to live in love. Crime and violence don't pay.
Welcome back, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The time is 8:31, and this is Cop Chat. If you're just joining us, you're listening to Ari. With me is Roleza, and our guest today is Honorable Grenville Williams, Attorney General here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Also, if you're just joining us, the topic this morning is what do the new amendments to the laws, the firearm and sexual offenses laws, affect St. Vincent and the Grenadines? Roleza, and you have some questions going in?
Right. All right. So I know that we touched briefly on life imprisonment, the definition of the term or what it means here for us. So you could probably just expand a bit on that, please.
Okay. Well, as mentioned earlier, sentencing generally takes two forms. There could be a fine, which is a monetary penalty, or there could be confinement, imprisonment, going to jail, as we would say in the common parlance. In relation to rape, which was not amended, in relation to sex with a minor under the age of 13, again, this was not amended. And the reason is that the penalty is already life imprisonment. To the ordinary man, when he hears life imprisonment, what comes to his mind is that for the rest of his natural life. So if you're 20 and you're convicted and you hear life imprisonment and that person lives until they're 80, you would naturally anticipate that that person is going to be in prison for the next 60 years. However, that's not what life imprisonment means under our current legislative framework and construct. By rules established by the Supreme Court, by judicial pronouncements, we've arrived at a position where life is seen as a period of a maximum of about 30 years. So you're not going to prison until you're 80.
30 calendar.
Yes,
Right.
yes. And that's an important point. It's 30 calendar years. However, on the street, you would hear that person say, well, a jail term is actually 8 months.
Oh, it's 8 and not 9?
Well, 8 or not 9, because that's an interesting point as it relates to how the law is interpreted. Because, in fact, a jail term is 12 calendar months. What the law says, however, is that for good behavior and for industry, you could remove 1/4 of the period. So therefore, we remove 1/4 of the year. So we are down to about 8-9 months. But the year is actually a 12-month period. But we've come to a point where we've applied the Prison Act, Section 42 in particular, I think it is, in a manner where a person says, well, I got 2 years, but in fact, it's not going to be 24 months. It's going to be either 16 months or 18 months because I'm going to get, 1/4 of immediately. And of course, there are different circumstances that may result in a person sentence coming down from the maximum, because many of the things I stated here were the maximum. In many cases, persons on the ground will say, but he had a gun. How come he only got X amount of years and the maximum was 7, or it is now 10, or it is now 15?
Or how he out so soon.
Or how he's out so soon. But there are many factors based upon the sentencing guidelines that the court must take into consideration when they are sentencing an individual. So the maximum is the starting point. But when you look at the mitigating circumstances, which are the good things on behalf of the defendant, or you look at the aggravating circumstances, which are the negative things on the side of the defendant or against the defendant, then we come down. But life imprisonment, in the legal framework, we start at 30 calendar years, and a prison year starts at 12, but we almost take off 3 to 4 months by taking off a quarter. So if we take off 3 months, you could go down to 9, or depending on how they calculate, you start at 8. So that's why we have a situation where persons will tell you they are not going to prison for a calendar year. And life does not mean for the rest of your natural living period.
And then it makes me wonder sometimes how much of it is a deterrent, actually. But anyways, that's a different topic.
I have a question. So we recently discussed a case in which a man, 53-year-old, claimed that a girl, 12 years old, forced him into sex. But the charges read that he had unlawful sexual intercourse with a 12-year-old being under the age of 13. And there is another charge, yes, that he committed indecent assault against the same 12-year-old being under the age of 15 years. So my question is, what is the difference in these charges? Where he's charged under the 15 years of her being under 15 years and her being under 13 years?
Well, that question I cannot specifically answer. What I could say, however, is what the statute says. The statute says, the statute doesn't speak to a 12-year-old. So it doesn't matter really what age you are, as long as you're below 13. The wording of the legislation itself says a girl under the age of 13.
Is this at the time of the act?
Well, yes, you would have been under the age of 13 at the time. So you could be 20 years now and it's being tried, but at the time you were 12 or 11 or 10 as it is. So charge is based upon the wording of the legislation. So there may seem to be some quirks in the charges sometimes, but the charge is guided by the specific text of the legislation, because there's no charge in the legislation that says a girl under the age of 9 years old, by way of example.
Okay.
If you're 8, it's still under the age of 13.
Okay.
So it depends on the specific wording as outlined in the statute or the act. But that is why you would see it shaped that way, notwithstanding the person could have been 8 years old.
Okay, so there are different sentencing guidelines for under 13 and under 15.
Yes,
okay.
There will certainly be different consideration because, as you would appreciate, as you get to 15, there are certain changes. One, you're getting closer to the age of consent, which, as we know, is not 18. In addition to that, there could be mitigating factors depending on the circumstances. For example, if it's a young man, and we're speaking about a young man here, but it could be a young woman, but a young man under the age of 19, he would be looked at differently than a perpetrator who is, let's say, 35 or 45 with that same person. Because for the 19-year-old, his judgment may not be so well developed that he may see a 15-year-old who looks a bit more mature. But if you're 45, 35, we expect you to have a little bit more discernment. And therefore, the factors that the court would take into consideration would vary based upon some of those issues.
All right. Okay. So listeners, just to note that we are taking calls and questions via WhatsApp 457-9997 at this time. All right. So you have a question in relation to the topic this morning, you can feel free to call or to send in that question. All right.
So there has been public discourse over the age of consent. We've heard the opinion of the Prime Minister. We've heard the opinion of the opposition leader. What is your opinion in the age of consent? Should it be raised or is it good at 15?
Well, what I would say is that my role as the Attorney General is to give effect to policy. Policy is set by the cabinet. Policy is set to an extent by persons who represent Vincentians by being elected. There's a distinction between cabinet and parliament, but of course, parliament, which constitute both the side that won the election and the side that lost the election, they would have an input to an extent on the formation of policies. They would have an input on the formation of bills before it gets to parliament for more open debate on both sides. The Attorney General, therefore, does not have a professional opinion that is different from the policymakers.
Okay.
And I think while there is much debate as to whether or not we should improve or increase the age of consent from 16, the question is 15, 16.
Right.
Question is, what informs that requirement for change? A lot of persons will argue, well, in order for you to take part in the democratic process, an election, you must be at least 18, historically 21, but we're at 18 now. And the argument may be, if you can only make a decision for the state at 18, why is it that you are given permission and authority to make a decision about your own autonomy at the age of 16? The research is still open on this issue, whether the age of consent at 16 or 18 makes a significant difference. What I will say is that there are enough or sufficient provisions under the Criminal Code, Part 8, that deals with sexual offenses, that would allow us to prosecute matters in appropriate circumstances. What we need, however, is engagement from the public. If you're a victim, you need to report this to the police. If you're a witness in a matter, you need to cooperate again with perhaps the victim and the police in order to ensure that the existing legislative provisions could assist somebody who is a victim in those circumstances, who acted against their free will.
All right, so I have a question. With regards to this same topic, right? So the Honorable Prime Minister has said that he's putting it to the public for their opinion, for their feedback. The leader of the opposition has said the same thing, right? Now, we cannot necessarily use Facebook as a general source for gathering responses from the public. But should the public and persons like me who are vocal about it being raised to the age of 18, what, maybe in your professional capacity, can you suggest we can do to get our voices to be heard in regards to us wanting, for those of us who advocate for it to be changed to 18, what can we do to get our voices heard?
There are many mechanisms available to the public to give their input, to have a say in the shaping of policy, eventually the drafting of the bills and what becomes legislation. We are speaking today of the amendments to the Firearms Bill. We are speaking today of amendments to the Criminal Code, in particular Part 8. Why do I go back there? Because for the Firearms Bill in particular, we publish this in the national newspapers, all three newspapers.
Yes, yes, sorry.
And one of the reasons, the main reason we publish it, but one of the reasons is that we invited the public at large, we invited civic society, we invited the Bar Association, we invited professionals, lawyers, doctors, whoever they are, other persons in other professions. We invited everyone in St. Vincent who had an opinion on these pieces of legislation to write to us to say we are heading in the right direction, we don't need a change, or we are heading in the wrong direction. What I could say to you is that the responses were almost nil. So what is available? You can write to the policymakers, you can write to the Attorney General to give your input. And when the Prime Minister speaks about coming to the public, one of the initiatives we will take is, again, publishing something in the newspaper or through whatever medium to ask the public, what is your perspective on it? Of course, your perspective ought to be reasoned and balanced. But as the saying goes, even the dull and ignorant too have a story and a perspective. So we want everyone, as far as possible, to share their opinion on these issues, because you're right. Facebook and some of these social media platforms, they have their purposes, they have their rules. But again, just because two persons say it or a class of persons say it, it does not mean that there is a general desire for movement in a particular direction. But certainly if we get the professionals, the lawyers, the Bar Association, if we get the public at large, if we get the churches, the civic societies to contribute their perspective, these are things that will be taken into consideration and reflected in the changes where they are appropriate.
Yeah, but what I would say though is I do not think that traditional newspapers is an effective way to get feedback, especially in a society like St. Vincent, where I do not believe that we're an aging society. I do believe that the majority of young people would, as it relates to population, would overpopulate. They're in a larger demographic than the older population, and a lot of persons aren't really looking to the newspaper for this information. You're right. I've seen it published. I've seen a number of things published that persons would look over because they're published in the newspaper. So I do suggest that you do utilize social media and different mediums, as well as even town hall meetings and stuff. Live stream this stuff on these issues, because if it goes to the three papers, it would go overlooked. And this is no disrespect to the papers, but I'm being realistic as it relates to getting information out and getting feedback on these laws, because they are being debated publicly, and persons do feel like Roleza feel very strongly about these things.
All right. So could I probably just say we can submit letters to the Honorable AG's office
Certainly,
in writing and
certainly.
reasoned opinions, etc.?
Certainly, and I will
Very
ensure
good.
that they get to the cabinet and as well as the other stakeholders. But I do agree with you, Ari, that we need to employ all of the mechanisms available to us. We need to employ shows like this, discussions like this for persons. But one of the problems that I find in society, and I call it the rum shop approach, we have very strong discussions and we meet as individuals in corner and we are vociferous and we are loud and we are boisterous and we want to be heard then. But when you're actually asked to put your idea forward in a forum where a difference can be made, we find very few persons who are willing to stand up and let their voices be heard.
And I don't disagree with you at all.
All right. So we have a caller coming in. So caller, could you call back at this time, please?
All right. So as we await that, I know we have limited time because we still have to touch on the firearms. But you had mentioned prostitution, and I do think that's something that people overlook here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So before I get right directly to my prostitution question, what about these underground strip clubs that we're having here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines? Is there anything set by law to prevent these things, or are they operating legally?
Well, I would not necessarily. Well, I'm not sure what information has been shared with the law enforcement agencies. The police would have to investigate. And certainly in my position, I am not here to say whether something is happening lawfully or unlawfully, because of course there is separation of powers. But certainly if there are instances where we suspect as something that is happening that we may feel or suspect that is in contravention of the law.
All right. So let's call up quickly.
You can finish your talk quickly.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Good morning, caller.
Yes, good morning, Ari, Rosila, and your guests. So I spent the last 3 weeks following a case in the Supreme Court here in the country that I'm living in. And I came to the conclusion, like as in Charles Dickens said, the law is an ass. What are your views on that? At least not fair.
All right.
I don't think the caller give me much there that I can comment on. So as I was saying earlier, there's separation of powers. So there is the police who investigate the crime, there's the prosecutor, and of course there's the judiciary who would do an assessment and make their pronouncement. If we suspect that there is something happening that is in contravention of a law, we could call the police and we could do so in an anonymous fashion for them to investigate the circumstances and decide whether or not there is a breach of the law. But yeah, so I would leave it there. It's for persons to call and communicate their suspicion to the police and for the police to investigate to see whether or not there's a contravention of any laws.
And as it relates to prostitution, you did mention that prostitution is harder to prove. Should I go by the dictionary's definition and say prostitution is the practice or occupation of engaging in sexual activity with someone for payment?
Well, yes, that would be...
Does the law say what the payment is? Is it monetary or...
Well, that could be open to interpretation, but let's say it's monetary.
Okay. Now, the reason why I'm curious about this is you would have persons publicly bragging, okay, I am seeing this person because they can give me XYZ, and you're sleeping with them for these gains. Could that constitute to prostitution by law?
So more like gifts. If you're in a relationship, that's gifts, all right?
If you're not in a relationship.
What I would say is certainly as it relates to the law, the law goes on evidence. So, you know, as a man, as a woman, we may say lots of things. And we may say things that are not true. We may say things that are in our imagination. In some instances, they may be true. But what is the evidence that those things actually happen? So until we get to the point of evidence, then we are not necessarily looking at criminal offenses. We are not looking at prosecuting anyone. Because if we go and sit on any street corner right now, we'll hear lots of stories. That's human nature. We like to regale people with stories. But it's not necessarily something that we can prosecute without the evidence. So I think that's where we would
All right, so we'll take one more call before we get into the firearms.
All right, and then we have another question. So, caller, good morning.
Good morning to you and good morning to Mr. Williams.
Good morning to you as well.
My question is to Mr. Williams is to what is your take on the issue of, for want of a better word, maybe, for taking away the prosecution in sexual offenses, to take it away from not really to take it away, but to stop the issue of where maybe parents or somebody in the local parlance making up a case, to take it away from them and the state to the prosecution against the perpetrator.
Okay, I think what the person is saying is that there may be instances where a minor, let's say a girl under the age of 13 or a girl under the age of 15, is engaged in an act, and because I've heard this discussion on the street, and then somebody, the perpetrator or somebody on their behalf, would approach the parents to say, let's find a way to make this up in common parlance. The fact is, as I alluded to earlier, all these matters as it relates to, and any other criminal offense, depends on the availability of evidence that is admissible. So if the police has evidence of in the circumstances, they certainly can take action. In my view, sometimes you have to be legally audacious. You have to be creative in the way you use the law. And for example, if there's someone who is preventing by some means a prosecution where there's evidence, we can deem that as obstruction. And we could look at using an obstruction mechanism and obstruction provision to persuade the person to allow the law to take its course. So my thing about it, though, is first we have to look at evidence. And oftentimes we have a lot of discussions that something happened in a community, something happened to someone. But the police, the prosecutor, the courts can really only act where there is admissible evidence. So I think that is what we have to focus on. What I would do is I would encourage members of the public that if they are a witness to something, whether it's firearms, sexual offenses, that they share that information with the police.
All right. So I don't want the segment to end, Copchat to end without us discussing firearms. You mentioned, and we usually hear when we're reading cases, possession with intent to supply, possession, illegal possession of whatever. What constitutes to possession? Because persons would hear possession and they think, okay, once I'm caught with the firearm on my person, that's possession. But really, what are the three elements of possession?
Well, I won't say elements, but there are different constructs to possession. So, for example, you mentioned that a firearm was found on your person. That's really relatively easy and simple and straightforward. But let's suppose you are traveling in a vehicle and all three of us in the vehicle, and the firearm was found on the floor of the vehicle. That's where possession perhaps becomes a little bit more technical, because the question is who in fact possessed the firearm, because it's sort of found in a general, it is a confined area, but it's also in a general area because it's not found on any of our persons. So you have the actual possession is on your body, but you have the constructive possession. So possession is not always a simple thing.
Yeah, I know there's knowledge, ownership,
and right, but the straightforward one is in my hand. The more complex one, it's in an area that is sort of under my control and sphere of influence. You spoke about possession with intent to supply. And one of the things we look at under the firearms legislation is trafficking in firearms. So that's where possession with intent to supply would come in. What supply really means is that I have it in my possession, but maybe I have several, and I am going to provide it to Roleza, I'm going to provide it to Ari, of course, for a fee. So I am supplying you. So it's basically trading in the thing.
So is it the same as drugs where when you have it in a large quantity, you cannot prove that it is for your own personal use. So it has to be to supply to someone else.
In the case of drugs, if I have several pongs, I may be a casual user, but am I going to use that amount? The answer is probably going to be no. So more likely than not, I am selling the thing. If I have one firearm, maybe I'm using it for my own illegal purposes. But if you find me with 10 firearms, yes, I could be using it because I may want to change my firearm depending on the circumstances. But the presumption at that point in time, it has to be proven, is that you're in a position to sell those firearms to Roleza, Ari, several other persons. So it's akin to supplying.
Okay.
So it's trading in the thing, really.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So we have another question here. Is it mandatory for a judge to apply discounted sentences to offenders?
The judges are guided by the sentencing guidelines. And as I alluded to earlier, there are mitigating circumstances. In other words, beneficial circumstances to the defendant. The judge must take those into consideration. There are aggravating circumstances that go against the defendant. The judge should take those into consideration. So they are guided by the sentencing guidelines and other guides and rules that impact how they could make their decision. What historically, a lot of sentences were based upon decided cases, precedents, but you would find some unequal delivery of sentences. What the sentences guidelines do, however, is sort of try to codify the circumstances that should be taken into consideration. So you have a more uniform and balanced sentencing coming out. So if a person is found in a firearm in the similar circumstances, and when you look at all of the issues together, they are the same, you should see them getting the very same sentence. But yes, they are guided by the sentencing guidelines and other rules and so on.
So we're at the top of the hour. It is 9 o'clock here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Is there anything that you'd like to add before we end the segment today?
I would just simply say that the law continues to evolve. The law is dynamic. Amendments are going to continue, not just with the firearms sexual offenses, but all criminal law as well as other pieces of legislation. What we would want to see is public involvement and engagement, and we want to make other provisions available even in the criminal realm. So, for example, we don't necessarily have a probation system. We want to have a probation system because that helps persons as they're going back into society. We don't necessarily have a legal aid system here, where if you can't afford, the state would provide for you through a mechanism. So there are things like that that we need to address. Community sentencing, because sometimes the argument is if you send someone to prison and they're not accustomed to the system, they come out more hardened, where a more appropriate sentence maybe to send them into the community so that they do something positive. They are punished, but they are not put into the prison and become a hardened criminal. And of course, some other non-custodial sentences, because we see in some countries that the harder types of crime, the numbers go down where you treat an individual as a human being. Prison doesn't always allow for the humanity of an individual to be taken into consideration. And not that I'm saying we treat people as animals, but if you treat someone like an animal, they will behave like an animal. If you treat them with dignity and respect, they are more likely to behave in a manner that is dignified and respectful. So we have some reforms that should come on stream at some point in time. And at the end of the day, if someone goes to prison and they have done their time, we also need to find a way to reintegrate them into society so that they become productive members of society. Going to prison once doesn't mean that I should be labeled as a jailbird prisoner for the rest of my life, especially where I, have done my time and I recognize I've done wrong and I'm trying to become a better person for it.
Well, thanks for joining us this morning, Mr. Williams. We do look forward to having you again because there's still a lot that we could discuss, but it was quite an informative Cop Chat this week, and we do look forward to having you here again.
Echoing.
Thank you very much.
St. Vincent and the